September 11th, 10 years later, this morning on For the Record. Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. It's hard to avoid cliches when talking about the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, the hardest being that it changed everything. But suffice to say, it changed a lot. Much has been written and broadcast in the last week on the people most closely and deeply affected by the attacks and the lives of the nearly 3,000 people killed that day. This morning, we will look at the ways it has changed our politics and the security of our country and our world. My guests are two political scientists from the University of Wisconsin, Charles Franklin and Andrew Kydd. And thank you both very much for joining me this morning.
Good to be here.
I think, what I'm going to do, Andrew, is start, because we're taping this on Friday, and there were reports towards the end of the week of credible threats of terrorism, and we don't know what's going to transpire between now and when this is aired Sunday. I just would like to get your assessment of what you've read and heard up to this point about credible threats. Would it make sense that these would come out even through Sunday?
Yeah, it certainly would. Al-Qaeda is an organization which has been very interested in symbolism at all levels. Symbolic attacks, targets like the World Trade Center, symbolize American financial might, the world economy, et cetera. And so symbolism is very big for them. Anniversaries are big for them. There were documents found when bin Laden's compound was raided, which included some thoughts about possible anniversary attacks. So it makes a lot of sense that there would be an anniversary attack, or that they would want to implement an anniversary attack. That said, though, so the desire is there, is the capability there? And the capability is really much diminished. I mean, if you think about what's happened in the past 10 years, Al-Qaeda is just a shadow of its former self. And so, I mean, from bin Laden, of course, on down, bin Laden is dead. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, is in custody, and so many others have been killed by drone attacks or captured in Pakistan or Afghanistan. And so the organization is just on fairly weak terms at this point. The new defense secretary, Leon Panetta, just said that he thought the strategic defeat of Al-Qaeda was within reach. Some people criticize that, but there's no question that the organizational capability is not what it used to be.
Could you define what is meant by a credible threat? Is there a common definition or agreement on that?
I'm not sure there's a commonly understood agreement on that. I mean, the phrase I've heard is credible but non-corroborated. So what that says to me is that they've got some information from a trusted source, but not from multiple sources. So there was somebody that they trust, that they believe had accurate information. They said it was specific. So that would seem to indicate that it's about specific people, or at least a small number of people, maybe a name or something like that. They talked about some people coming into the country recently. So that seems to be the specific element of it, from a trusted source, but not apparently from multiple sources, because they specifically say non-confirmed.
And we're ascribing some significance to the 10th anniversary. I mean, there have been 10 now anniversaries of this, and I don't remember whether for each one there was talk of a credible threat or not, but I don't remember it being...
It wasn't a big deal. I think at the first one there was some concern that there might be one, but as time went on, it became more and more clear that the resources simply weren't there. I mean, people initially thought after 9/11 that Al-Qaeda had lots of sleeper cells all over the United States, hidden in Muslim communities here and there. And that's just clearly not the case, because, I mean, bin Laden was patient. Al-Qaeda is a patient organization in a sense, but they're not waiting for the 10th year anniversary. If they could have done it at the first year anniversary, I think they would have.
Charles, as we look at the political landscape today, can you help us with 10 years ago and what impact that has on our world, on our political world today?
You know, there's some things that have changed quite a lot, others not so much. It's very interesting how selective the effects have been. So I think the things that have changed and continue to change are the American public's sense of fear that we could be the object of an attack, that what happened 10 years ago could happen again today. And if you sort of think of the long time of the post-World War II era, Andy not so much, but us who remember something of the Cold War and duck and cover drills in school, that fear of the Soviet Union was very real in the 1960s, but started to diminish as we went through strategic arms agreements and détente with the Soviets and so on. And then finally, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, largely went away. And so 9/11 was this reintroduction to a new generation of a sense of threat, that something could be done here on American soil. And the political system responded so strongly to that. Go get on an airplane and you have a sense of what that means. Think of the Patriot Act and the expansion of Homeland Security as an organization. All of those things, I think, have dramatically changed. The other that, of course, has dramatically changed is 10 years of constant warfare with a very small military of volunteers that has faced deployment after deployment after deployment to fight those wars. That, too, has changed and persisted. But in terms of our broader politics, or at least our partisan politics, I guess you could say that Barack Obama has become a war president and one who expanded the troop commitment in Afghanistan, has dramatically increased the use of drone and other attacks, secret attacks in Pakistan and so on, not to mention the bin Laden attack. In all of those things, you've seen a Democrat who, under any other circumstances, you would think would be an anti-war Democrat, pursuing war in Afghanistan and its surrounding areas and anti-terrorism every bit as powerfully, if not more powerfully, than President Bush did. So all of those things, I think, are real changes.
I want to talk more about that. We're going to talk more about the state of terrorism in our country and the world when we come back 10 years after 9/11, right after this.
The most extraordinary bottom line reality today is that as we look back over the 10 years, as we all know, thank God, and thanks to everybody who's worked so hard, there has not been another mass casualty terrorist attack on the United States by violent Islamists since 9/11. I don't think anybody would have predicted that on 9/12/01.
September 11 is part of our present reality. The reasons I mentioned before and some others for which those people attacked us on September 11 live. The people who attacked us under that banner of distorted Islam still want to attack us under the banner of distorted Islam. And they are planning to do it as we memorialize the 10th anniversary. So we cannot use this as an opportunity to say, oh, let's put this behind us. We should remain in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in that part of the world until people in that part of the world, significant numbers of people, stop trying to figure out how to kill Americans.
Well, there's one politician whose career, legacy was changed by that day, huh?
Dramatically. Mayor Giuliani was sort of on the downturn of a political career that morning, and it dramatically changed it. He came to sort of symbolize the stalwart response, for better or for worse, of how to react and how to persevere through the 9/11 tragedy in that week and month and forever.
Andrew, you mentioned the material that was found in the place where bin Laden was killed. There was kind of a flurry of reports initially after that stuff was initially found, and it seems like we haven't heard a lot in the last month or so. Can you tell us what's going on there, and will that be as important to our understanding of the state of terrorism in the world as you would think? One would think.
If I did, I'd have to kill us all, I think. It's not a lot has come out, to my knowledge anyway, from certainly in specific terms about what was there at the compound and what intelligence they've gleaned from it. you can make slight inferences based on some successes, some drone strikes, that they perhaps got leads about who to follow and where to go subsequent to it. But it's hard to say in general what they really picked up from that.
Or even that we're a safer
clearance.
place because of it?
Well, I mean, I think there's a general impression that we're a safer place simply because of the sort of diminished stature of bin Laden. I mean, there was sort of conflicting reports coming out initially about whether we should interpret his being there as, like, isn't he sort of pathetic figure? He's isolated, he's sitting there watching reruns of himself on TV. But some other people were saying, no, he was actually still engaged in planning of attacks in a more hands-on sort of way. I mean, my personal leaning in the absence of detailed information would be more towards the former, that he didn't seem to be a guy in charge of a big organization that was capable of doing all that much at that point. Although he did have a stable residence, he was not seemingly in close touch with operatives all around the world in the way that he used to be, certainly.
Is there any other group that's sort of under the radar right now that could suddenly emerge in sort of the Al-Qaeda mode?
Probably not in the Al-Qaeda mode. I think the ones that might emerge as important are more locally organized or more locally concerned. There are sort of Al-Qaeda branches or groups that look to Al-Qaeda in some sense in Yemen, for instance. And that's becoming increasingly problematic because of the political instability associated with the leader. Is he going to stay? Is he going to go? Is there going to be a democratic revolution there? Is that going to be hijacked by Islamists? The whole Arab Spring, though, has really undermined, I think, Al-Qaeda and that whole message, that whole Islamic fundamentalist critique of the West and democracy by showing that, in fact, democracy has widespread popular support in the Muslim Middle East. So I think there's no sort of big surprise lurking there. There are still very powerful groups that are pro-terrorism against the United States. There's Hamas, there's Hezbollah, there's Iran supporting them and supporting smaller groups here and there. But those are sort of known players in a sense.
This is a question I had for him, so I'm going to ask it now, and then I want to get back to you, Charles. But the idea of the Arab Spring, is it linear? Can we make a direct connection between the immediate response of the world to September 11th and what we're seeing now in those Arab countries?
I would be hard-pressed to draw that line in a very direct way. I mean, the Bush administration certainly rhetorically embraced the notion that we want to promote democracy in the Arab world as a counter to terrorism. And the analysis being that if people are politically frustrated, if they're oppressed, then they are going to turn towards more extreme solutions. And the analysis of Egypt often was along those lines, that Mubarak is suppressing the opposition, and that makes the Muslim Brotherhood strong because they're the only people who are capable of withstanding that. And so they embraced that, but they didn't really push it very hard, and it certainly didn't happen on Bush's watch. So to say that policy led to this result, if it did, it led to it through a very long chain of causation, which wasn't terribly obvious to begin with. And when it happened, the United States wasn't particularly eager to jump on board initially, even in the Obama administration, semi-notoriously at this point, because of obvious concerns, which were the same concerns that inhibited the Bush people when it came to practical issues, right? Because it's hugely destabilizing. You've got known quantities which aren't perfect, but they're better than the worst alternative, and then you're going to throw those guys overboard and hope for the best, but something bad might happen. So I think there was a lot of hesitation about that, and it was only embraced sort of after the fact.
So everything Andrew's been saying here, Charles, raises questions in my mind about how this administration and this Congress, and even in the upcoming election, talks about issues of national security, spending on the military. It seems to me that we're still in this post-Iraq, Afghanistan sort of response, rather than looking towards what might be actually happening a lot in the Middle East.
I think it's a very difficult problem for American politicians. So we went through the Bush administration in which Republicans generally found it very difficult to criticize a sitting Republican president. And it was only after the height of 2006's uprising in Iraq and the electoral defeat that the President Bush finally shuffled his cabinet positions a little bit, brought in a new defense secretary, changed the command in Iraq, and courageously put in the surge, which led to, or at least was accompanied by, ultimately, a dramatic decline in violence in Iraq and some success with General Petraeus and others leading that. So I think that, we went through a period where criticism was limited from within the party. Criticism from the Democrats faced the difficulty. The Democrats didn't want to appear weak on national security issues, so I think they muted their criticism some. Now I think we're in a little bit of a strange transition period where President Obama has been as vigorous in the prosecution of the Afghanistan war and the strikes on terrorist targets as anybody has ever been. It makes some in his own party rather uncomfortable with what he's doing. And we're for the first time beginning to hear some voices from within the Republican Party questioning why we're in Afghanistan, what is our purpose there, and what does that mean. So I think the consensus of the post 9/11 period that going after bin Laden and al-Qaeda was, first of all, the top priority. You can have a big debate about the Iraq War and how it was tied in, but the point was we got engaged in that, we continued that engagement. Now we're getting past that and we're asking what comes next. And is it possible to have a global war on terror that's not fought with large numbers of troops in other countries, but special forces, drone attacks and things like that? And finally, which is the party that's more supportive of military conflict, which is not? How does that work out? And I don't think anybody really knows. I think both parties are finding it a difficult transition to go through.
We're going to be back with Professors Charles Franklin and Andrew Kydd right after this.
On that day, guys from my firehouse, my best friends, were some of the first firefighters into Tower 1 after the plane hit. A firefighter in full gear, carrying 60-something pounds of hose and equipment. Takes about a minute to climb one flight of stairs. These guys were looking at 80 stories just to get there. Then they'd start working.
I felt the mood that we were going to put the fire out. Everyone seemed to be confident. I know I was.
It's a scene from the CBS special that's airing tonight, Sunday night, at 7 o'clock on 9/11, 10 years after. During the break, Charles, we were talking just a little bit about how difficult it is to talk about this story. There's the range of emotions is extreme. I want to read an email I got and ask you both to just respond to it. Just a viewer who was responding to one of my editorials last week on this 9/11 and sending 9/11 an endless remembering. Post 9/11 America isn't supposed to be 9/11 over and over again. Eventually we have to experience 9/12 because fighting a war to hold on to the memory of a terrorist attack will only lead us to an echo chamber of paranoid fear. And talks about the endless toxic remembrances. I mean, there's some political undertones there, but I just wonder if you feel any validity about the response to 9/11 and how it influences how we think and act.
Well, I think as history goes, of course, our impressions change. Pearl Harbor meant something very different to my parents' generation than it has to mine. So there's an inevitable shift in the long run. But I think this remains the singular traumatic event, certainly of the last 40 or 50 years. post the assassinations of the 1960s, you're hard-pressed to think of the time that you remember exactly where you were and what you were doing. I don't think that's going away from my generation in a while.
Yeah. Do you still, is there benefit to, is there national benefit?
I think there is benefit in recognizing a danger. I think there is, of course, actually a danger in exaggerating that. When the Russians had nuclear missiles, we faced a threat to our very existence. Terrorist attacks threaten to kill hundreds or thousands of our citizens, does not threaten to destroy our country. I think in this whole 10-year period, how the political system comes to grips with that limited but very real threat has been one of the hardest things to come by.
This is so awkward. I feel like I'm asking you, Andrew, now what do the terrorists think? But in terms of how the rest of the world looks at this remembrance of 9/11, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think it may bring to mind the initial sympathy and support that there was for the United States in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. I think that was real, and it was diminished certainly by the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The Iraq War is winding down now, and so not that the memory of that will fade either, but perhaps 9/11 can be remembered for its own sake as a tragic event, and certainly bound up with the history of what happened subsequently, but not identified with it either.
Do you teach classes on this topic?
I teach a course on terrorism, and we of course discuss 9/11.
Yeah.
But it's not a course on 9/11. I probably wouldn't be teaching a course on terrorism if 9/11 had not happened.
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah. So there's certainly a legacy in my life and my students in the level of interest they have for it.
And in both of you, the study of political science was influenced by it.
Indeed, especially national security issues, and also how do you identify terrorism and terrorist networks? And political science has some small things to contribute to that element of promoting national security as well.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And a reminder about CBS's show on this evening at 7 o'clock. We're to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. Many of you have participated already in observances of the 9/11 anniversary this weekend. Tonight, again, there's a special on CBS, 7 o'clock on 9/11, 10 years later. My thanks to Professors Charles Franklin and Andrew Kydd for coming in today. And thanks for watching us. We'll see you next week for another For the Record.